Hello everyone, my name is Maylin Dye and I prepared a short presentation for you about HIV or human immunodeficiency virus. As stated previously, HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus. If this is left untreated, it can progress into AIDS, which stands for acquired immunodeficiency virus. To the right is a picture of HIV under a microscope. There is still quite a bit of unknown with regards to HIV. However, researchers have determined that it originally came from chimpanzees in Central Africa. In this form, it was known as SIV or simian immunodeficiency virus, and then from there it mutated to infect humans. And the way it spread to humans, researchers believe, is that hunters in the area may have captured or killed chimpanzees and then fed it to their people, and it spread through contaminated meat. On this slide, I included some of the symptoms of HIV. Those symptoms include fevers, chills, rashes, night sweats, muscle aches, fatigue, sore throats, mouth ulcers, and then swollen lymph nodes. The really concerning and scary part of HIV is that usually you don't show symptoms right away, and it can take up to 10 years, sometimes longer, for it to progress into AIDS. And sometimes within the first 2 to 4 weeks of being infected, the person might experience some flu-like symptoms or like a slight cold. And that stage, it's your body's initial response to being infected. And during the first 2 to 4 weeks of infection, it is really easy to pass HIV along because the amount of HIV in the patient's blood is very high. On this slide, I want to talk about the way that HIV is spread from person to person. Essentially, HIV is spread through the mixing of bodily fluids. The primary way that HIV is passed on is through unprotected sex. And in the United States, specifically, 75% of cases come from male to male sex, and then it can also spread between females and males because the HIV the virus can be present in the vagina or cervical fluid. Another way that it can spread is through using unclean needles, so through intravenous drug use, and then it can also spread from a mother to child through the placenta. And then another rare but possible way for HIV to spread is through accidental blood pricks or blood transfusions. Those cases in the United States, at least, are extremely rare because there's so many safety precautions and measures put in place to make sure that clean, sterile needles are used in doctors' offices and hospitals. These are the 3 stages of HIV. The first stage is acute HIV infection. It can last up to 12 weeks. There's large amounts of HIV in the blood. It's highly contagious, and a patient might experience some flu-like symptoms. The second stage is chronic HIV. This can last between 10 and 12 years. You can transmit it to others during this stage, and during this stage, the immune system is constantly being weakened. The CD4 cell count continues to go down, and I will talk about that more in the rest of the PowerPoint. And then the final stage is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. It's the most severe stage. At this point, the immune system is extremely weak, and the survival rate is 3 years. So here's a graph that I drew so you could visually see what is happening with HIV. The blue line is the amount of HIV in the blood, and then the green line is the number of T cells in the blood, and T cells are very important in the immune system. So in the first 12 weeks, which is the acute stage of HIV, the amount of HIV is increasing and the amount of T cells is decreasing. That's just kind of your body's initial response to infection. And then as you move into chronic stage of HIV, the number of T cells is continually dropping, and then the amount of HIV in the bloodstream is continuing to rise. Here's a diagram that I drew to help us understand the mechanism of HIV. So the blue molecule is called GP120, and it's a molecule of HIV-1 that interacts with T cells and enables the RNA inside the virus to get into the cell. So this green thing that I drew is called CD4, and it's basically a membrane marker that enables the virus to get into the cell. But in order for CD4 to properly function, it also needs a co-receptor, which is what is drawn in pink. And so down here, basically, it binds together, and then it makes the membrane of the T cell, we'll just pretend this is a T cell, it makes the membrane of the T cell more permeable and enables the virus from HIV to get into the cell. And so since HIV is an RNA retrovirus, it is able to use the enzyme reverse transcriptase, and reverse transcriptase is able to make DNA from an RNA template, and it's also considered proviral DNA, which means it integrates its genetic code into the host cell's DNA. And what that means for the immune system is this right here is normal genetic code, and here is normal genetic code. But this, what is in blue, is defective retrovirus or defective genetic code. And so you kind of get a mix of normal proteins, defective proteins, and then normal proteins. And since you have fewer normal proteins being produced, your body's not able to launch an appropriate immune response. Also, with the defective proteins being produced, something that's unique to HIV is that it is very prone to making errors, and so it's hard to develop drugs to appropriately treat HIV because the defective proteins are changing very often with how many mistakes that are made. There are a number of treatment options for people who've been diagnosed with HIV. However, there is not currently a cure. A lot of times the virus or the drugs are prescribed in combination with one another, and they work to slow the progression of HIV, and they do that through preventing HIV, the virus, from getting into the host cell, and they also work to slow the transcription of the virus. Unfortunately, HIV has a pretty sizable impact on the community. In the United States, approximately 1.2 million people have HIV, and 13% don't know it and really need to go get tested. Infection rates among males is 5 times higher than females, and 10,000 people die due to AIDS each year. A promising thing to note is that new infection rates have been on the decline since 2015. One thing to note is that HIV impacts different communities disproportionately. For example, in the United States, 42% of cases were in the Black African American community, 21.7% in the Hispanic Latino community, and multiple races was 18.4%. 70% of cases worldwide are believed to come from Africa, and only 1/3 of patients in Africa are able to receive treatment, and this is due to many political, economic, and cultural barriers. Here are some of the references that I used. I thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I really hope that you learned something.